All right, thank you very much for joining me today. I am Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, joining you by Zoom in order to talk to you about preparing raised bed gardens. A lot of people down here in the south of Mississippi use a lot of raised bed gardens for a variety of reasons. And raised beds are often planted in areas where the soil is several inches higher than that of natural grade. What we're doing is we're raising up that grade of the soil because it really helps us out, particularly if we have areas that are low or areas that collect water, and areas where the soil doesn't drain very well. So if you have heavy clay soils where the water just doesn't percolate very well, raised beds are a really good option for allowing you to have that garden space without having to do an awful lot of work in order to modify that existing soil. Raised beds are also a really good option where we have limited garden space, and we'll talk about why that is here in just a couple of seconds. So particularly if you have just a small backyard or even a small front yard where you can get in a garden, raised beds are a really good option for that. Some of the advantages that we have in raised beds, I love growing my vegetables, so I'm going to talk about growing vegetables a lot, but you can grow flowers and shrubs and other things in raised beds as well. But raised beds, particularly for vegetables, are often more productive in a particular area. And because we're not having to worry about wasted space for rows or anything like that, we're not going to be walking between the plants, so we can really put those plants closer together. We can also get those plants closer together because we're really managing the fertility of the soil and managing the water in that soil to allow us to get a lot of really good nutrition and keep those plants really healthy. One of the problems that I frequently run into with plants is soil compaction. As traffic moves across the ground, that tends to press that soil down. And soil compaction can be very bad for plants because we're not walking on the soil in those beds. Those raised bed gardens have really good, light, fluffy soil that really helps out the growth of plants. Another great advantage for raised beds, I know that in the early spring, people are just raring to go with their gardens. So one of the things we can do with a raised bed, because they're lifted up out of the ground, as they're raised up, very likely they're going to warm more quickly, and that's going to allow us to get planted just a little bit earlier than we would be able to do in the native soil. Now, to go along with that, there are a few things we need to pay attention to when we are growing in raised beds. I come from a plant pathology background, and so I'm always thinking about plant diseases. So when you have a lot of plants close together, what can happen because of that is it can restrict the airflow between plants. And what that leads to, particularly if you have overhead irrigation, is water staying on the leaves for longer than it would otherwise. That reduced airflow leads to that water hanging out a little bit longer. And because of that, sometimes we have a little bit more problem with foliar diseases. We are going to need to water a bit more frequently. Because raised beds drain so well, we need to make sure that we're keeping water in there. And because we are putting more water through them, we do tend to need to fertilize more often because some of that water is going to leach out the fertilizer that we use. And because there's some materials involved, raised beds can be a little bit more expensive to get started with than just a garden in native soil. Now, when we're building a raised bed, there are a few things that we want to keep in mind. One thing that I think is really important for construction is just the nature of the bed that we put out there. And it's a really good idea to not make your raised beds any wider than about 4 feet. That just allows you to be able to reach down into all parts of the bed from either side, keeps you from having to step into the garden, again, prevents some of that soil compaction. What I really like to do is make my beds 4 feet wide by 25 feet long. That makes a 100 square foot raised bed, which makes my math really simple when I'm looking at calculations for rates of applications of fertilizer or any other material like that. And it also gives you a chance to walk between other areas in your landscape without really having to go around a very long way to do that. If you do have a much longer bed, it's a good idea to have a crossover, basically give yourself a little path every 25 feet to have plenty of space to walk around your garden. Now, you can have a raised bed just by adding soil to the growing area, adding in mixing soil amendments like compost, sand, or sawdust that's been composted down, bark into the native soil. You can also pull up the soil from walkways, place that on the beds. That way you can fill in those walkways with mulch materials like pine needles to prevent having to do a lot of weed eating and keep those weeds down between your beds. So a raised bed, technically speaking, we can make that just by mounding up the soil. But in my experience, every time I've attempted to do that, the soil tends to kind of fall right back out, particularly as water goes into it. That soil is going to want to spread back out. So most of the time, we're going to use some sort of framing material to contain that. And that can be wood or bricks. Cement blocks are a popular favorite for me. Railroad ties, landscape timbers, really anything that's going to be able to pull that, to hold that soil in is really going to work well. You can see up at the top there, a really decorative arrangement of bricks. So when I think about a raised bed, I think about a rectangle or a square shape, but there's absolutely no reason why you have to be limited to that, particularly for ornamental beds. If you're going to have flowers in there, you can have any sorts of shape, any sort of shapes that you can imagine to really beautify your landscape. Now, if you are going to use lumber in the creation of your beds, you do want to use treated lumber. I get this question fairly often because of the use of an old preservative in wood. It has been used for about 17 years now. So those new products, which I have there on the screen for you, but we're not gonna go through all that. You can use those perfectly safely in the construction of vegetable beds. So unless you have some really, really old treated lumber laying around, the treated lumber that's sold nowadays or that you're likely to have is perfectly safe for the use in vegetable beds. Oftentimes people will want to line the sides of the beds, some sort of polyethylene fabric, and that just helps to prevent the roots from coming in contact with it. And sometimes it can help the wood last a little bit longer. What I would warn you about is you don't want to use plastic down on the bottom of the beds. What that can lead to is the water not being able to get out of that soil. So essentially the water will just be trapped in there and the plants won't thrive because there's too much water in. So cost for building raised beds really comes down to what you're going to build. They can be very expensive and they can be very inexpensive. And a lot of that's going to depend on the cost of the frame materials, the growing media you use. So your price for a 4x4x12 raised bed can be anywhere between $30 to $275. You can see the picture on the top there. Some fairly expensive materials, but a great appearance. The picture down there at the bottom is from the Bay St. Louis Community Garden, where we use a lot of raised beds. We have 22 of them now, and they're all made with cinder block and our soil, much less expensive and a really durable way to make those raised beds, so it lasts a really long time. Of course, one of the great advantages of a raised bed is that we can amend that soil or really just create an entire new soil for the bed. And this is, again, really important in areas where we have a lot of clay or down here on the coast of Mississippi, sometimes where we have a lot of sand, because our soil is just going to lose water too quickly, or it's not going to drain quickly enough. Or if we have a new constructed area where there's a lot of severe compaction, having that raised bed there is really going to make things a lot easier to work with. And there are a lot of growing media options that are available for creating a raised bed. And you could purchase topsoil and compost and pine bark mulch, soil conditioners and peat. All of those materials work very well mixed in the right ratio for a raised bed. And there are a lot of commercial prepackaged growing mixes that are some mixture of pine bark mulch and peat and a few other materials. And again, like the frame materials, that growing media can vary from fairly inexpensive to quite inexpensive. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend the use of potting soil in a raised bed, but a lot of garden soils or raised bed soils are available from a range of different brands. If you would like to make your own potting mix, so if you have a number of raised beds or large raised beds, it can be more cost effective for you to make your own soil mix from the different components that make up these commercial soil mixes. The recipe that you see on your screen now is designed for woody ornamental planting beds. So your ornamental plants are going to do a lot better in this planting mix. And this is made up of 6 parts pine bark mulch and 1 part sand. So relatively inexpensive materials. And don't forget that you are going to need to make sure you add your lime and add your fertilizer there. Always adding in a little bit of compost if you have it available is really going to help with the structure of this material. So that's a really good recipe. Again, if you're growing something that is a woody ornamental. For tender annuals, which would include vegetables and a lot of our flowers, this is the recipe that I use. It's 4 parts pine bark, again, a relatively inexpensive material, 1 part peat, and then the same mixture of limestone, that's 10 pounds of dolomitic limestone per cubic yard. Or if you're making up a smaller amount, that's just a ½ cup per cubic foot. And then 14 pounds of a slow release fertilizer, ideally with micronutrients per cubic yard, or 3/4 of a cup per cubic feet. There are a lot of brands of slow release fertilizers out there. Osmocote is a common one. It's available in a lot of different formulations. So make sure, again, you look at the formulation. 18, 6, 12, and other things like that are really good. And again, using that 10% compost is really going to help with your soil structure. So again, there are several types of commercially available amended soil that you can purchase. You can also purchase soil mixes from local nurseries and other areas that will deliver them by yard or different amount. And again, you can mix that in with the native soil. You can do that by hand, or you use a small garden tiller to do that. As we're building our bed, before you actually construct the bed, it's a really good idea to loosen or spade up the existing soil and leave that rough. You can turn it with a shovel when the moisture is right. And by leaving that soil surface rough, it's a lot easier for the roots of the plants to grow down into that natural soil once they grow through the soil mix. And another aspect of that is that soil mix is also going to more easily drain because it just doesn't have that hard surface of the soil that it's encountering. And I will do everything I can. I see a question there asking whether I'll make this PowerPoint available by PDF. I absolutely will do that, and I will check back with you about what the best way to do that is. Like I said, we're all learning these new technologies, so I hope you'll bear with me. Again, spade that soil down 6 to 8 inches deep. Blend in about 2 inches of that soil mix into the first few inches of the native soil. And then the rest of that's going to be the soil that you add to the raised bed. Make sure you check your pH. Even with raised beds, I really do advocate the use of soil testing as a way to make sure that we have all of the nutrients and the right pH for the plants that we are trying to grow. As I've said a number of times before, for our people here in Mississippi, I really think that soil testing is the best $8 that you can spend in horticulture. Keep in mind that a lot of the materials that are making up that soil are organic and are going to break down over time, just a natural process of decomposition. So the soil in those beds is going to shrink by about 1 or 2 inches per year. And so you will want to add soil back in, make sure you're soil testing to have the right fertilizers in there. And you can add amounts of agricultural gypsum, 20 pounds per 100 square feet, to the natural soil. It really just acts as a soil spacer more than anything else to help deep root growth, as well as supplying a little bit of extra calcium. Now, as with any garden we grow, we need to make sure that the location is right. Raised bed ideally needs to be located in full sun for best production for vegetables. And when we talk about full sun, I think it's really important that we recognize that I think whoever came up with the term full sun didn't live in Mississippi. So just make sure that we're getting about 8 hours of direct sun for most of our vegetables and our flowers. Ideally, we get that sun in the morning. And then if we're going to get a little bit of shade, having that shade in the afternoon is perfectly okay. When the day is really hot, giving the plants a little bit of shade from that really hot sun is going to work out pretty well. You also want to make sure your bed is going to be located near a water source, and ideally near the back door of your house, because that's going to make you go out there more often. But make sure you're close to that water source, because regular irrigation is going to be necessary for raised beds. As I mentioned earlier, you're going to plant a little bit earlier in a raised bed than a conventional garden, because that soil is going to warm up a little bit more quickly. By using mulches and using row covers, we can get about an extra 2 weeks into our growing season in comparison with a traditional garden. We can also use that same thing. We can use those row covers, avoid those first light frosts that we're going to get, and extend that growing season later into the fall and early winter. Another advantage of raised beds, we can use space a little bit more efficiently in order to get more production out of them. So block planting and using proper spacing will really optimize our yield. Make sure we stake your cage plants that need that in order to allow for the highest plant density. And use those trellises to make sure we let vining crops grow up instead of sprawling, just to make the most of the space we have in that raised bed. And largely, our large crops like tomatoes or squash are going to need to be on about a 24-inch center. Things like cabbage and potatoes and corn are going to be about 1 foot apart. And then you have your medium-sized vegetables like snap beans, peas, and onions. They can be planted about 4 to 6 inches apart. And then small crops like leafy greens or root crops, a lot of times we can just plant those by scattering seeds over a small section of our soil. Now, this is a longer chart, and as was requested, I will make this PDF available to everyone, so you don't have to sit here and hastily jot everything down. But another thing I would encourage you to do on the extension website, which is extension.msstate.edu, you can look up the Garden Tabloid. That is a really excellent resource for vegetable gardeners in particular, in order to make sure you get everything like your plant spacing, even dates of planting and things like that. They're going to be really important for you in growing vegetables here in Mississippi. Another idea that's really great for raised beds is successional planting. And what we do in this is we group our vegetables together based on when we are going to be harvesting what we want from them. So we plant all our short season crops in one area, and then as they stop producing, we can then remove those and then plant something in their place. So things like lettuce and radishes, those leafy crops, finish production, and then we can come behind them with beans or cucumbers. So we're getting more use out of that space by being able to rotate our crops in time. We can also use interplanting. This is something I'm really interested in. And that's just planting compatible crops together to make sure that we're minimizing the unused space in our beds. So some examples of that, you can see basil planted underneath squash, kale and dill planted together, and then tomatoes and baby lettuce planted together as a way to get the absolute most space we can out of those raised beds. Keep in mind that a lot of plants we like to grow fantastic in the fall, and I'll be putting on a presentation later all about fall planting and getting prepared for that. So I'd encourage you to come to that. Things like broccoli and cauliflower and collards grow really a lot better in the fall than they are going to in the spring. So successional planting also gives you that opportunity. Get those fall crops in and have some vegetables all throughout the year. Now, watering is going to be a really important topic for our raised beds. We absolutely need adequate soil moisture, having enough water for all of the important parts of plant growth. And the text on the slide is actually something I pulled out of another presentation. What I really liked about it, the most critical period for adequate moisture: seed germination, early growth, flower and fruit development, root enlargement, and following transplanting. And really what that comes down to is all the time. So the most critical period for adequate moisture is really the entire time the plant is growing, because we want those plants to stay really happy and healthy. A lot of the soil mixes we're going to use in a raised bed tend to drain excessively, particularly the first year we have them out there. And so we are going to have to water more frequently than we would in a traditional planting. One of the classic ways to test this is what we call the finger test, where we just stick our finger down into the soil 2 to 4 inches, and if it feels dry, we need to water. We use that technique in container vegetables and container plants all the time, and we may be putting in 2 inches of water per week into that area if we don't get any rain. And I know we've been having some pretty dry weather right now. And a lot of people use sprinklers as a method of watering raised beds and really other gardens as well. And there are a lot of choices for garden sprinklers out there. Everything from a simple garden hose with a spray nozzle to some semi-automatic equipment. You want to keep in mind, you don't want to apply water any faster than it can sink into the soil. You don't want that water just getting on the surface of soil and running off. That can result in erosion or getting puddles. It can also cause soil compaction. Overhead sprinklers do tend to wet the plant leaves, so you want to water early in the day, and that just allows the leaves to dry off, particularly before night, to help keep some of those leaf diseases down. And each watering, we want to wet the top 3 to 5 inches of soil. Frequent light waterings tend to actually be kind of damaging. It results in shallow rooting and susceptibility to drought later. So the trick to watering, if you're going to water with a sprinkler, is to water infrequently but deeply. So giving them a lot of water but not giving them water quite as often. You also want to pay attention, make sure the sprinkler is not going to have something that's blocking that pattern of application. Sometimes you're going to need to mount the sprinkler above the tops of the plants where wind will blow the water around, but you don't want some plants blocking the spray of water so that water doesn't get to all of the plants in your garden. One very easy way in order to figure out how much water you're actually applying is to put some small cans around the garden and just water and then measure the amount of water that's in that can. And that'll give you a really good idea of how much water you're actually putting out every time you turn on that hose. Do keep in mind, again, overhead sprinklers are going to wet down the plant leaves. So we want to water early, allow those plants to dry. One of the things, because again, I have a background in plant pathology, overhead watering is always kind of something I try to avoid. And a drip and trickle system is a system, or soaker hoses, a variety of other names we can use, is a really good option for watering, because what it's going to do is it's going to apply that water right down to the base of the plant where the plant actually needs it. It's going to avoid a lot of problems. These systems tend to operate at low pressure. They're delivering a small amount of water very slowly through the holes or emitter tubes in there. And it makes it possible to water a large garden all at the same time. One of the things that I think is great about these drip trickle systems or irrigation systems is that you can set them on a timer, and that way you don't have to worry about going away for a couple of days, or if you're really busy in the morning and you need to run off really quick, you don't have a huge problem with your garden not being watered. You don't have to stay behind and make sure that you're there to turn off the hose. Now, there is a disadvantage that goes along with these drip systems, and that is that they do tend to cost a few dollars to get started. But I think they make up their value in the time they save, as well as the increased quality of your garden. So again, we can water that whole garden all at the same time. Another advantage of this is that you can actually go out and harvest or cultivate, do all of your other garden chores while you're actually in the midst of watering. And keep in mind, we just want to make sure we're going to have to pay for it. There are a number of different systems available through mail order catalogs and local distributors. And usually these are going to consist of a supply line that's connecting to a garden hose, and then a number of delivery tubes that are actually run down right next to the plants. And down there in the bottom right, you can see a sort of homemade version of that that's just made from PVC pipe that works very well also. Now, some advantages of these drip systems is they are going to reduce water use by as much as half. The water is placed right where the plants need it, at the base of the plants, not in our walkways, not sprayed all over me as I'm trying to walk in the garden in the morning. It does permit that working in the garden while we're watering, keeps those plants dry, which is going to lessen some of our disease pressure. And that correct use of our irrigation system is going to keep those plants actively growing in the dry periods, but we're not going to have a problem where we're overwatering following irrigation. One of the things great about these, we're never going to allow that soil to completely dry. We're going to avoid a lot of our water stress. A lot of us here in South Mississippi, we like to grow tomatoes, and one of the most frequent problems I run into is blossom end rot. And if you've grown tomatoes or squash or peppers, you're really familiar with this problem where the end of that vegetable just looks black and awful. And that really is a problem with uneven water, and drip irrigation systems are a great way to make sure that watering stays even and reduce your problems with things like that. We also need to fertilize our raised bed gardens, and we are going to need to fertilize a little bit more, but generally we're going to fertilize very similarly to a traditional garden. Most of our soils are going to be based on natural topsoil, and what I, again, normally recommend, I really think it is the best $8 in horticulture, is getting a soil test through your local county extension office. It's going to give you some really specific directions on where you should when you should fertilize, exactly what fertilizer to use. And I and my fellow extension agents are always happy to help you interpret those as well. This page just has some general recommendations, using about a half a cup of triple 13 in a 4x4 bed at planting, and then an additional third of a cup a few weeks later on our long season crops like tomatoes and eggplant and peppers. Our leafy green vegetables, use a fertilizer. It's going to be high in nitrogen, just to maintain vigor and really good green color. Just to avoid over-fertilization. And again, though, I do give you a basic recommendation here. I really think soil testing is a good option for you. Mulching, it's another thing we do in our raised bed. Mulch is going to slow down the loss of water, cool our soil a little bit. So summer mulches like straw or mini pine bark nuggets, we can place those around our vegetable plants, really help out their growth. Apply about a 2 to 4 inch layer around our younger emerged plants, and then over the soil after it's warmed up. Don't apply it too early because you are actually cooling the soil, and you can actually slow down the growth of the plant if the soil is too cool. One thing that works really great as a biodegradable mulch, if you still get the newspaper, you can recycle them and use those as a mulch in your vegetable garden. Place those down prior to adding other mulches. Any year that newspaper is going to break down, it's just adding nutrients back to your soil. All right, well, that brings me to the end of my presentation for today. So I'm going to go ahead and stop that share right there so I can see everybody. And what I'm going to do is I've got this set now, so if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself. There's a mute button down at the bottom left for you. And if you'd like to ask a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself and speak up. And then you can still ask a question by typing in the chat box if you would like to. All right. I usually give everybody a few minutes. We usually have a few people not wanting to speak all at once. But again, if you do have any questions, I'm just going to give you just a couple of minutes. If not, thank you again for joining me. Again, we're going to have another presentation on Wednesday and on Friday. You can find that information on my Facebook page. And you can also find it on the Mississippi State University Extension page. And so our Mississippi State University Extension Facebook page. I would always appreciate you joining me. So if you have any questions, I am happy to answer anything. Oh, we got a thing where we're saying that unmute won't work, and sorry about that. I have fixed that. That's a little technology problem. I do have a question there on how to keep tree roots from creeping into the beds. That can be a little bit of trial if they're coming up from underneath. You can try to use a landscape fabric down base. I've never found that work very well. And so unfortunately, I wind up just removing those tree roots when they're small, when they're trying to come into the bed. I have another question. Is the 25-foot max length just because of the walking length? The 25-foot length really is a recommendation based on two things. One is convenience. Part of that is if you are going to use an irrigation system, that 25-foot length works very well. But it's also, again, I don't like doing complicated math. So having that 100 square foot area makes life really easy for me. But having that shorter irrigation line kind of prevents some problems that we didn't go into in a whole lot of detail. How should you close up a bed for winter? I'm going to be honest with you, I never close up my beds. My beds are working pretty much year-round, so I have a spring season and then a fall season and then a winter season. So there's not a lot of time when I'm not growing something in them. But if you do want to close them up, there's a couple of things you can do. You can mulch heavily in them. What I will do occasionally if I have other beds is I'll actually keep a layer of plastic and actually extend that over the bed during the time when it's not growing. And that just prevents sunlight from going through and will prevent a lot of the weed problems that you might have otherwise. Another thing you can do, particularly if you're having any problems with soil diseases or if you're having issues with nematodes or something like that, using a heavier gauge clear plastic, like a 6 mil clear plastic, you can stretch that across the bed. particularly if you're doing that in the late summer. That will raise the temperature of that soil, and you'll actually reduce your populations of some of those nasty diseases and nematodes, solve a lot of problems for you for the next season. See another question, what is the optimal depth for a raised bed? And that is a really good question. The minimum depth that I would use would be 8 inches because most vegetables are going to send down roots about that depth. My preference is to have a foot just because I like to have that extra space to make sure that my plants have plenty of room to grow. One thing that I've found personally is raising up those raised beds a little bit higher is really convenient because it's a lot nicer to be able to sit down as I'm working rather than stooping or kneeling all the time. I see, do I recommend gypsum and lime? Gypsum, again, more of a calcium additive and a spacer than a pH modifier. The lime is absolutely necessary for most of our growing. We want to really make sure that we are paying attention to our soil pH because that really is going to control how well our plants are able to take up nutrients from the soil. So I absolutely do recommend lime. It's less frequent that I recommend gypsum. There's a question from Mr. and Mrs. Mounts. Will there be an option for an online Master Gardener program in the near future? That unfortunately is a question that needs to be addressed to Dr. Jeff Wilson. He's our state Master Gardener coordinator. And there has been discussion about that, but I wouldn't want to misquote him. Or to give you any false information. Please do keep in touch with us about that, though. I know here in Hancock County, we tend to run our face-to-face Master Gardener class in the evenings, particularly for people who work. But I can't say anything officially or really knowledgeably about whether that will be offered online in the near future. All right, any other questions? Would love to hear from you. All right, and there's a comment here that says, Jeff, there is a plan for that. Just again, stay tuned and we will have more information on that in the future. But it does look like there is a plan in place to do that in the relatively near future. That's the online Master Gardener class. Again, I will try to post a PDF. Excuse me, I'll post the PDF of these of my slides. I hope I'll be able to do that in link with the video. If not, I will find a way to host it and get that to you. Some of you have provided me your email address, and for those people, I can try to email it out, but usually the files for these presentations are kind of large and difficult to send, but I may be able to do that. And again, I'll get that information to you as soon as possible. I do want to remind you, we do have some presentations coming up in the near future. I'll be back on Wednesday. Wednesday is going to be 2 o'clock. I'm going to be talking about insects and diseases in vegetable gardens. A lot of us want to get rid of the pests, the aphids and stink bugs and everything else that get in our vegetable gardens, as well as deal with things like early blight on our tomatoes and blossom end rot. So tune in 2 o'clock on Wednesday. That link should be right where you found the link for this presentation. And again, I see those emails, so I'll definitely try to get that PDF to you. Thank you again for joining me. Again, I encourage you to join me on Facebook. Find Mississippi State University Extension Service on Facebook as well for great information on gardening, as well as other important topics. And again, I really do encourage you to look for the presentations that have been put together by Dr. David Buys. Some really great information out there for you. So thank you and have a wonderful day.